Hi, my name is Carly Schertino-Polter, and I'm the director of the ARC Advocacy Network. Case conference season is always stressful, and after a year of e-learning and trying to teach our children ourselves and worrying about our children's progress, it's even more stressful. So, what can you do to ensure your child is getting a free and appropriate public education? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to get on the same page with the school, how to determine where your child is currently at academically, how to meet their needs so they get an appropriate education. We're also going to talk about ways to get appropriate accommodations, ways to encourage a smoother transition back to in-person learning, including behavioral changes and behavioral needs. And we're also going to talk about your rights under Article 7. This is going to be an in-depth discussion. And yes, that's code for it's going to be long. I know this is a stressful time, and if I can help you prepare and help this process be easier, I'd like to help. So, one thing I want to make clear, COVID changed a lot, and it changed a lot with schools, but it did not change the laws that govern schools or special education. Schools must still provide a free and appropriate public education. Schools must provide appropriate accommodations to students with disabilities, and schools must adhere to the timelines laid out in Indiana's Article 7, which are Indiana's special education laws. Those timelines were not extended or adjusted during the pandemic. And remember, virtual days are instructional days, and in some cases, that really matters. So first, let's make sure everyone's on the same page and that we're working with a common purpose and focus. We all bring our own thoughts and experiences and perspectives into those case conferences, and we don't always communicate that well. So let's start there. I want to share my screen to share a tool that I think could actually be helpful. So this is something called a life trajectory tool, and this is from something called Charting the Life course. And it's a 2-page tool that includes the portfolio and a planning life trajectory. If your child's getting services through the Bureau of Developmental Disability Services, like the Family Supports Waiver, hopefully you've seen this. If you haven't seen this, or your child isn't getting services through BEADS, you can find this and all sorts of other materials and videos at lifecoursetools.com. And the best part is that they're all free. And the whole idea behind Life Course is, what is your vision of a good life and how do we help you get there? But we can break this down a little more for our current situation. Let's do one for what does a good return to school look like? This is a way to get everyone on the same page to let the school know what your ultimate goal is so you can work together and achieve it. So, for example, here in this purple box, this is where you're going to put, what is your vision of a good return to school look like? What are the past experiences you've had that would make that more likely? What are the things you need moving forward to make that more likely? But just as importantly, what do you not want? What would actually make a return to school more difficult? What are the experiences you've had in the past that would get you down that path? And what are the things you need to be careful to avoid so that you don't go down that path? And so part of it too is you want to be specific. Instead of just, I want him to read at grade level. Is it really that you want your child to read at grade level? Or is it really, I want to prepare him for adulthood and be able to read the things that he'll have to read in life, like letters from Medicaid or job notices or medical forms? Is it really, I want him to be able to stay in school all day? Or is it really, I want him to have the coping skills he needs to handle the stress of school enough to stay at school all day so that eventually when he's an adult, he can work in the community? Is it, I want him to have additional math instruction or support? Or is it really, I want him to go to college and his weakness in math may keep him out, so he needs additional supports? Telling the school what you want is important, but telling them why you want it may open other options to achieve your ultimate goal and may encourage the school to provide the supports you're requesting. But I also don't want you to forget that portfolio. And that's the second page to this life trajectory. And so this is essentially a giant cheat sheet to your child, because here in this teal colored box, it's what do people like and admire about me? Here in this orange box, it's what's important to me. And down here in the blue box, how do you best support me? Imagine if you can give that information to each one of your child's teachers, how much easier that could potentially make things. Because again, you've essentially created a cheat sheet for your child. Then here you've got the integrated support star, which is where you talk about what resources your child may have to achieve their goals. And in this case, to achieve a smoother transition back to in-person learning. So what relationships does he have that may help with that return to school? What eligibility specific options does he have? What community-based supports are available to help with that transition back to school? What technology could help? And that's a huge one that often gets overlooked. And then also, what personal strengths and assets does your child have that may help with that return to school? You can also set up regularly scheduled meetings with the teacher and include that in the IEP, just as a way to ensure that everyone is on the same page and to prevent any miscommunications or misunderstandings. I know an instructional aid or a dedicated one-on-one paraprofessional is something a lot of families want, and it's really difficult to get. If that's something you want for your child, that you want to ask for, why? Be ready and able to explain why your child needs this, what they need an aid to do, and what support the aid could provide. And most importantly, why is it appropriate? Remember, schools do not have to do what's best for a student. They must do what's appropriate for students. So that needs to be the language you use. You also need to consider all options. Does your child really need a one-on-one aid? Or could an aid that's focused exclusively on 4 students work? Be open to the possibility that there may be some technology that could also support your student instead. Maybe instead of an aid reading a story out loud to your student, maybe there's some technology that could read it out loud to him that would be just as effective. That it won't always work, but it may be an option and it may be easier to get. You can ask for a consultation with the school's technology specialist to see what could benefit your child. Next, we need to find out where your child is actually at academically compared to their same grade level peers. And that's the key, same grade peers. We shouldn't compare students in special education only to other students in special education. To get an idea of how successful a student is or how they are progressing in their education, we need to see how they are doing compared to all students in their grade level and how your child has performed in the past. I know parents are worried that their child has not progressed this school year. Many are worried that their child has actually regressed. Let me reassure you, every parent feels the same way. Not just parents of students with IEPs, everyone feels behind and everyone is experiencing regression. So don't be afraid or embarrassed to document that. Maybe take videos and tell the school about the regression struggles that you see. Schools are worried about regression too, and I genuinely believe that all schools are going to be focused on remediation and bringing all students back to grade level in the next year as life starts to return to normal. But to know how to do that, we need to know where our kids are at academically, and we need data. Too often, progress reports say things like, he's progressing in this goal, which doesn't actually tell you anything. Or, he's doing great. Well, your definition of great and my definition of great may not be the same thing. So we need data, and it's okay to insist on data. That's what they're supposed to be recording. Share your concerns with the school. Tell them what you see. If anything, we've learned how important videos are in this year. So record a video of your child reading a grade level appropriate book out loud. Record them doing their homework. Document how long homework takes so the school can see what you experience. I have to say though, sometimes we accidentally give inaccurate information, and that leads to a lot of the miscommunication and frustrations between families and schools. I know a lot of us sit with our kids and help them with their homework. Sometimes it can take hours, and sometimes we make them redo a worksheet or a problem 2 or 3 or even 6 times because we want it to be right. I mean, homework's supposed to be correct, so we work with our kids to make sure it's correct. That's where the accident comes in, because we're telling the school that our child is struggling in math, but all the school sees is that he's getting hundreds on all of his assignments. They don't see that he had to redo more than half the problems over and over again. They don't see us walking our child through this problem step by step, so they don't see the problem. And when they don't do well on a test, they just think it's test anxiety. That's not the school's fault. As hard as this is, and I know it's hard, we need to resist the urge to overhelp our kids with their homework because we're making the school think our children are doing better than they are. This is also where documenting the time your child spends on assignments or recording a video of your child doing that math problem can really help. Especially this year, it is reasonable to ask for evaluations to determine your child's current capabilities. That could be a full psychological evaluation, but it can also be specific evaluations for subjects you're concerned about. For example, if you're concerned about reading, you can ask specifically for a reading evaluation. You can ask for a speech evaluation. If you've got a targeted concern, you can ask for a targeted evaluation. That is a reasonable request, and the school should conduct the evaluation within a reasonable time frame. And once you get those results, you can start planning based on that data. If you don't understand the results, ask questions. Meet with the school so they can help explain the results to you. That can be really helpful. However, you also want to see if you actually agree with the results. If the results of an evaluation the school doesn't reinforce what you see, or if you disagree with those results, you can request an independent educational evaluation. If you're part of a special education co-op, the co-op is not an independent evaluator. When you request an independent evaluation, the school should provide you with a list of evaluators that they have contracts with who can conduct the evaluation. You then choose who you want to conduct that evaluation from that list. Now, the school will also get a copy of that evaluation because they're the ones paying for it, so you need to be aware of that. And that can also give you reliable data, whether it confirms the school's results or shows something different. In my experience, both as an advocate and as a parent, I have seen schools try to use a screening tool as an evaluation. Those aren't the same thing. I've seen schools tell parents they don't do evaluations or they don't have to do those anymore. That's not accurate. I've heard schools say that after the initial psychological evaluation that qualified the student for special education services, that they don't have to do those again. That's not accurate. I've had schools tell parents that they must arrange for an evaluation through their doctor and pay for it themselves. That's not accurate. I've had schools try to bring in the special ed co-op when a parent asks for an independent evaluation. That is not independent. And I've had schools say, oh, we know he's behind, we're working on it, so we don't need to do a whole evaluation. That's not acceptable. I've had schools say, oh, he's not due for one right now. That doesn't matter. Stay strong and respectfully insist on the evaluation. You need data to do appropriate planning. Technically, schools can refuse to conduct an evaluation, but they have to have a really good reason to refuse. We don't have the money is not an acceptable reason. We did an evaluation earlier this school year and nothing's changed. Yeah, that could be a reasonable reason to refuse, although that's when you can also request an independent evaluation. Once you have the data about their current capabilities, then you can start making an appropriate education plan. What are your child's deficits and how are you going to address them? That's where SMART goals come in. And no, that's not me being sarcastic. SMART is actually an acronym, and it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. It needs to be specific and it needs to be measurable. So instead of Johnny will tie his shoes, a stronger goal would be Johnny will independently tie his shoes in 3 different environments within 1 minute on 4 out of 5 data days. And you can decide on how many prompts it would take or how much assistance a person should get. Another example could be, in timed math quizzes that his grade level peers take, Johnny will complete 15 math problems with no more than 2 errors in 1 minute on 4 out of 5 data days. That is specific and measurable. but it also has to be reasonably achievable. If your child is 4 grade levels behind in reading, it's unlikely that they'll be able to make all of that up in one academic year. But it could be reasonable to grow 2 grade levels in a year and slowly build that up. It also has to be relevant, meaning it has to be related to education. You may have a child who has sensory issues that result in him being a really picky eater. It's certainly something to work on, but being a picky eater doesn't really have anything to do with his education, so it's not really a goal the school can work on. And finally, it must be timely, meaning a time limit of when the student should achieve the goal. Now, usually in an IEP, that's going to be an academic year, but it doesn't have to be. So for example, you can write some transition goals focusing on transitioning into a new school or a new setting, and that goal could only be for the first 6 weeks of school or the first grading period. If you only have PE for one semester, you can write a goal for PE that only lasts for one semester. But one of the other things that I recommend is making 3 lists. What are your non-negotiables? What are the things you absolutely must have in the IEP or you will not allow it to go into effect? What are the things you're willing to negotiate about? There's a lot of room for compromise, and that can be a good thing. And finally, what are you willing to ask for and give up? It shouldn't be this way, but this is a negotiation, and schools need to feel like they got to win too. So what are you willing to ask for, but you're also willing to give up if you need to? That will help give you some internal guidance as you craft your child's IEP. This is also where you can talk about compensatory education. If you can show through data that a student has regressed, it is reasonable to ask for remediation to regain the skills they've lost. And this is also where you can talk about extended school year services, or ESY. That's the official name for summer school. Keep in mind that ESY is only designed to prevent regression, and regression beyond what a typical student experiences. Summer brain drain or the summer slide is the amount of regression a typical student experiences over summer break. ESY is intended to prevent regression further than the typical brain drain. It is not for remediation. Granted, that may sound absolutely ridiculous, but that's the threshold for ESY. Compensatory education is what works on remediation. I often hear schools say things like, oh, we don't have summer school. That's just not legal. If you don't typically have it, design it. Consider all your options. Maybe that's the school paying for a tutor instead of having a formal class with multiple students. Depending on the child, that may be providing a computer-based program. I know that hasn't necessarily worked for a lot of people this year, and the last thing you want is more screen time. But there may be some students that a computer-based program could work for. I also hear schools say things like, oh, we don't have money for that. Again, that's just not legal. If something is appropriate for a student, again, not best, but appropriate, the school must provide it. Be open to alternatives, try to work with the school, but the school must provide an appropriate education. As a side note, and not COVID related, if a school tries to put a child on reduced days or homebound placement, they need to be actively working on a plan to bring the student back in a timely manner. That means providing the supports to work on the skills to bring them back. Putting a student on homebound placement and only offering 1 hour of tutoring per week with no other supports is not an appropriate education. And unfortunately, there are some schools who try to do that. Technically, schools are supposed to review homebound placements every 60 days, but that doesn't always happen. And it doesn't always happen with the parent. Remember, you are an equal member of the case conference committee. You have the right and the responsibility to help make these plans. The IEP also needs to include appropriate accommodations. During e-learning, you may have learned some new things that make school much easier for your child. For example, you may have learned that a 15-minute sensory break every 2 hours made a big difference in behaviors, work completion, and work quality. Share that. Especially if you document how it has helped, that would be a reasonable accommodation. If a student is supposed to have all materials read aloud to him, and it was in his IEP, and during the past year you discovered that wasn't happening, but you were providing that accommodation while he was home and his grades skyrocketed, that's a reasonable accommodation, and it's reasonable to insist on it. Now, that doesn't have to mean an aide must sit with him and read things aloud. You can use text-to-talk software to have a computer read it aloud to him, either with a mechanical or a human-sounding voice, and that's reasonable and essential to the student getting an appropriate education. I also recommend writing accommodations for when a student is in school in person and when a student is e-learning. Our job as parents is to hope for the best and plan for the worst, and that's true here too. However, even when COVID is nothing but a distant memory, and goodness knows I hope that is soon, this is still Indiana. There will still be snow days, and there will still be e-learning. So specify what accommodations your child needs during e-learning and what accommodations he needs in person. You want to make sure that the student can access materials in a way that accommodates their communication needs. That may mean typing instead of handwriting. That may mean paper material instead of technology. That may mean having materials translated. That is a reasonable and appropriate accommodation. When schools return, if a student is too medically fragile to return, it is reasonable to allow them to still participate virtually, and it is reasonable to request a tutor to come into the home for individualized instruction. Also be aware that some IEPs say accommodations will be provided when necessary. Decide what you think about that and consider defining how to determine when an accommodation is necessary. That can help take the guesswork out of when a student may need an accommodation. There may be some accommodations that someone may need only some of the time, but if there are accommodations that a student always needs, make sure the IEP reflects that. It's also going to be an adjustment going back to school, even if you've been on a hybrid schedule or you've been in and out throughout the year. This is a time to go back to basics just to shore things up. You may consider providing accommodations they may not have needed for a while, like a visual schedule. You may have the school build in more breaks for a few weeks as school returns. This is about putting some supports in place to preempt behavior so they don't happen. This would be a good time to consult with a behavior specialist with the school, the behaviors through the waiver, even your child's mental health professionals, to craft a plan to make the transition back to school as smooth as possible. While a waiver behaviorist can't provide services in the school, they can consult with the school to help with this transition. Let the school know that this is not only for the child's benefit, but it will make things easier on the teacher and the other students as well. This is also a good time to review a student's behavior intervention plan. Make sure it's still accurate and appropriate. Make sure the interventions still work, and suggest some new interventions you discovered during COVID that are helpful and effective. It may be helpful to get a new functional behavior assessment. This is an assessment that can help identify behaviors and identify the causes of those behaviors so a student can get the appropriate interventions or supports to avoid those behaviors. It helps identify why a student is having behaviors so that people can prevent them. The results of an FBA are then used to create a behavior intervention plan, which is part of the IEP, so there are strategies in place to help the student and prevent behaviors. Because it's part of the IEP, it's also enforceable, and all teachers a student has should be trained on the BIP and follow it. Be mindful of when to conduct the FBA, though. Doing an assessment while everything is changing and in flux may not provide accurate information. You may want to allow major changes like the start of a new school year or a sudden return from e-learning settle down before conducting an FBA. So I hope the information so far has been helpful, and I also want to make sure that parents know their rights and the options they have. First, I always recommend doing things in writing. It's certainly not required, but especially when things have time limits, doing things in writing can take away the he said, she said. Specifically, I recommend communicating by email so there is a time date stamp on it. By all means, feel free to talk in person, but then follow up with an email to prevent any misunderstandings. Again, while you're not required to ask for most things in writing, requesting it in an email is simply a best practice and gives you some protections. You are absolutely allowed to record meetings and conversations. Let the other party know you're doing it. There's nothing to hide and nothing to worry about. The school may also wish to record the meeting for their records too. That's fine. Because that can seem a little abrupt, I would simply explain that this way, if you can't remember something or you're confused, you can go back and listen again. Or you want to fully focus on the conversation rather than taking notes. Also, if the other parent can't attend the meeting, a recording will allow you to share it with the other parent. Again, If you request an evaluation and the school conducts one and you disagree with the results, you can request an independent educational evaluation. This is to be done at school's expense. Technically, the school can refuse, but only if they have a reasonable reason for refusing, like they just did an evaluation 3 months ago and nothing's changed. You also have the right to challenge that refusal. Also, when a parent requests an evaluation, schools have 50 instructional days from the time the school got parental consent to conduct the evaluation, which is different from a parent just requesting the evaluation, to complete that evaluation and reconvene the case conference committee. If you have a second grader and you ask for an evaluation and the school says, oh, we do those in third grade, that's not acceptable. You may need to be a little more direct at that point and say, no, we seem to have a misunderstanding. I'm formally requesting an evaluation. Also, schools are supposed to reevaluate a student every 3 years unless both the school and the parents agree it's not necessary. That's not often explained to parents. You have the right to schedule pre-planned meetings and include those in the IEP, or call for a case conference whenever you feel it's needed. You can have anyone at the case conference that you wish, and all of your child's teachers should be there unless you give consent for them to miss the case conference in advance. If your child has difficulty reading, the gym teacher really doesn't need to be there. But if the teacher you need isn't there, you can ask when they're going to join you. If the school says they were not planning for the teacher to be there, you can tell them that they need to be at the meeting, even if it means reconvening. So, what happens when you and the school disagree? Well, you've got options. I want to stress that it's more effective for you to stay polite and professional whenever you deal with the school. If all you're doing is yelling, or if you cry at all your meetings, the school's not going to listen to you. They'll dismiss what you say and it won't be effective. Be as effective as possible for your child. If you disagree with something currently in the IEP, you can convene the case conference committee to change it. If the school is proposing to add or remove something from the IEP and you disagree, you can contest that. Once upon a time, the only thing you had to do was refuse to sign the IEP and it would not go into effect. That is no longer true. Once an IEP is finalized, it automatically goes into effect 11 instructional days later, unless the parent contests it. And I would certainly do that in writing. A simple email to the teacher of record and administrator in the case conference committee saying, after reviewing the proposed IEP, I do not believe it is appropriate for my child and I'm contesting this IEP is enough. You will then reconvene the case conference committee and continue working on it. And you can do that more than once. You can also request a facilitated IEP, where an impartial third party, usually from the Indiana IEP Resource Center, comes in to help both parties reach an agreement. Because this person is impartial and independent, they can help facilitate discussion to hopefully come to an agreement. This is a free service, and you can request it from the school. If something very serious is going on and you cannot come to an agreement with the school, you can request mediation. This is certainly an escalation, and it will fundamentally change the relationship you have with the school, but that may not be a bad thing. Usually by the time a family gets to this point, communication is already pretty broken. Again, I would make this request by email. The mediator is not there to say one side is right and the other side is wrong. They are there to help both sides reach an agreement. And remember, Vegas rules apply to mediation. What happens in mediation stays in mediation. But it can help both sides come to an agreement. The school must pay for costs associated with mediation. Although if you bring in a professional like a doctor to provide information about your child, the school doesn't have to pay for the doctor's time. If appropriate, you can file a complaint with the Indiana Department of Education. A complaint is not saying school X is bad. A complaint is a formal, written listing of the ways you believe the school violated the law, the facts around that belief, how it affected the student, and what remedy you propose to fix it. There are many components that need to go into a complaint, and they're laid out in state law. When a complaint is filed with the Department of Education, the school has 10 calendar days to respond. Usually the school will try to settle things, but not always. At that point, the Department of Education starts an investigation into the school and the situation. You also have the right to file for a due process hearing. This is a court proceeding with an administrative law judge. And frankly, if this is something you're considering, I would recommend talking with an attorney. You can always contact Indiana Disability Rights, which is a state agency tasked with protecting the rights of people with disabilities. They have advocates and attorneys on staff, and they may be able to take your case. You can also contact Indiana Legal Services, Disability Legal Services of Indiana, or other legal agencies to help with a due process hearing. I know that was a lot of information, and I know, again, that this is just a really stressful time. I hope this information was helpful. And if you have questions, call us at the ARC of Indiana. Our family advocates will gladly talk with you about what's going on and help you figure out some next steps. You can call us at 1-800-382-9100 or 317-977-2375. Thank you and good luck.